Hey, Laura, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Mike is better this time?
Yeah, much better.
That's a lot better. That's a lot better.
Thank you.
We are live on YouTube.
Okay, thank you very much. We still have a couple minutes to go. Judge Murphy has just texted me that she is in a meeting and she'll be here as soon as she can. Ms. Gunther. Ms. Baird is there. Okay. Well, it's 4 o'clock. I guess we'll go ahead and begin. A couple of people have not joined us yet, but as I just told the ones who were here a little early, Murphy is in the meeting. She will join us when she can. We should, Mr. Cozart just is having computer difficulties, and so he'll be here shortly. There's Mr. Harris. I see him coming on. I see Ms. Baird. I've said hello, I think, to everybody else. So welcome, everybody. The first thing we have to do is to read the statement about why we're meeting virtually. And so I'll read that statement. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, state of emergency, and Governor Beshear's executive orders regarding social distancing, this meeting is being held via teleconference pursuant to Senate Bill 150 as signed by the governor on March 30, 2020, and Attorney General Opinion 2005, and in accordance with KRS 61.826, because it is not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. So that's why we're here on Zoom. Hello to everybody. We will just get right down to business after we approve the minutes. So you should have all reviewed the draft minutes. Is there a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
And seconded?
Seconded.
All right, seconded. All in favor, please say aye. Or raise your hand. And if anyone's opposed, please say no or raise your hand. Okay, the minutes are approved as written. Today we have two guests. We have invited Mr. Dave Barbary, who is just coming back from vacation. Thank you, Mr. Barbary. He is with the City Law Department. And we also have Lieutenant Jonathan Bastian. I'm not seeing him right now, but I know he's on here somewhere. There he is. And he is here with the Fraternal Order of Nuns. And so I guess I'll toss the first volley over to Mr. Barbary to start this whole conversation. And if you've been looking at our meetings, you know what we're talking about, Mr. Barbary. So would you take off for us, please?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone.
And I guess maybe what would be appropriate is maybe about a 10-minute overview of bargaining to give you all some background on it. We have had bargaining in place in Lexington since about 2005. It's a statutory creation, so it only applies to the divisions or departments of government that the statute has authorized it to apply for. So we have 3 of the divisions or departments in the government that have collective bargaining. They're police, fire, and corrections. There are technically 2 different contracts for police. There's an officers and sergeants contract, and there's a lieutenants and captains contract. The content of the and Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but for all intents and purposes, the content of both of those police contracts is largely the same with respect to a very few issues. But when you compare those 2 contracts with each other, they're largely the same agreements. The officers and sergeants contract technically expired earlier this year. Both contracts have what is known as an evergreen clause, which means that they remain in legal effect under their current terms until the parties reach an agreement otherwise. So they do account for the fact that you may have a situation like we have now where you're operating under a contract that's technically expired. The officers and sergeants contract has 42 articles. They cover a wide variety of topics. I think the agreement in total is more than 90 pages long. There are, from a general framework, there are some things that are deemed from a legal standpoint to be mandatory subjects of bargaining. Those would include wages. Another general rule of thumb is if you see expressly addressed in the contract and it's already in there, if you want to change that, that is also going to require you to bargain the changes to that provision with the other group that's involved in bargaining, which in this case would be the FOP. There is a disciplinary section in the contract, in both of the police contracts. I believe that the disciplinary section is identical in each one. And that is largely a reflection of what the state law calls for under the Policeman's Bill of Rights. There is kind of a process in there involving a review board that the police chief may utilize in making a recommendation to him about what discipline may end up being under the current contract. That part of the process for discipline is not in the state statute, but it is something that would need to be changed if there was a desire to change the reflection for it. For hypothetically, if you wanted to change the makeup of that board that gives the chief recommendations, that would be something that the FOP would have to agree to what that future makeup of that board would look like going forward. The bargaining process itself largely involves both sides having a team put together that sits in a series, I'll call it meetings, because I don't think we've ever had one that resolved itself in a single meeting. But the administration will typically have someone like the chief of staff, someone from the finance department, as well as budgeting, someone from the law department. We have also normally retained a professional negotiator with an outside private law firm. There will be perhaps a representative from the public safety department, in addition to the police command staff that might be on there. And then you'll normally also have a representative from the HR department in case there's a issue or issues that revolve human resources type things. So So we will normally have anywhere from 7 to 12 people on our side of the table. The FOP normally has about the same number of people. Oftentimes, you agree to a cap so that they're not worried about different people coming in and out of the process, because sometimes it'll take a number of months to go through a negotiation. It is commonplace in our experience that typically the sides will voluntarily agree to enter into a confidentiality agreement at the beginning of negotiations, so that the understanding is what is talked about in the negotiations will not be discussed publicly outside of the negotiating forum. In some respects, that has historically provided us political protection, because our concern would be, an example might be, if you didn't have that in place, we would want to be taking a hardline position on maybe an issue or issues with the FOP. And if you didn't have that in place, the concern would be that they might approach one or more of our elected officials to try to create some leverage to get us to move off of that position. So I think it also protects the FOP in a lot of respects, but it tries to take, at least in some respects, the politics out of the negotiating process. You all probably understand this already, but because it is bargaining, the general rule of thumb is both sides have to agree to any changes in the agreement. So, or to put other things in the agreement that aren't in there now. That is a very much a give and take process. I think typically, probably what would be a good way of describing normally the number of issues that might come forward during a particular negotiation. Each side may have somewhere between 10 and 20 material things in the contract that they would like to see changed. And then there's a great deal of back and forth about whether those changes will ultimately make it into the contract going forward or not. The typical result would be it may make it in there. It may make it in there with some changes, or it may not make it in there at all. The FOP is required to vote on the contract, to ratify it. I think, Jonathan, it's 51. Is it 51%?
It's a simple majority, yes.
Yeah. So at least 51% of their membership has to vote for the changes. I think that they do a pretty good job of trying to explain to their membership what all of the differences are that might exist in a new contract that's being put forward to them to vote on. We have a ratification process on our end where, after the FOP approves the contract, it is brought forward to our council, who then I think has like a 3-week window to make a determination about whether they accept it or not. And then the understanding is, if for some reason they didn't make a decision at all about it, it would automatically be ratified at that point in time. I think the other thing maybe to keep in mind, and it's just out there as kind of maybe an extra thing to have to concern yourself with a little bit in bargaining going forward, is a couple years ago, there was a Supreme Court case, the Janus decision, which eliminated fair share. So the union finds itself in the awkward position, maybe on some level, of kind of having to show their worth to their membership in order to retain their membership, because now their personnel has the ability to benefit from the contract without necessarily having to pay dues to get that benefit. So it's just an extra layer of complexity that I think both sides are still trying to see what the long-term effect of that might end up being. I think that at least in the short term, the FOP has seemed to retain a pretty robust membership number at this point in time. So I don't know if you all have other specific questions that you want to talk about. I know that there has been a great deal of talk previously, as well as probably in your group as well, about the discipline process. And that is something that is largely going to be driven by, you know, a need to change some statutory frameworks that are in place if there's a desire to go there going forward. Otherwise, I would describe the changes you could make to that process as maybe not being as impactful or meaningful as they would be if that statute was revisited and perhaps rewritten in some fashion.
Any questions for Mr. Barbary at this point, or shall we switch over and ask for Mr. Bastian to present?
Just real swiftly, what are the primary differences in the two CBAs for the police?
I would say the primary difference is you're going to have, obviously the wage structure is going to be different because it's higher, you know, and what's interesting is, and Jonathan can correct me, I don't think we have captains. So it's really just lieutenants and upper command staff that are addressed in that other contract. I think it's largely a wage differential. There are a handful of smaller items in there that I don't know that are really that material. I think generally speaking, they don't get compensated generally for most things on an overtime basis. So if a lieutenant is going to put more time in, there are exceptions to this, but typically a lieutenant's going to get compensated with comp time that they can use, you know, as extra leave time. They're not going to necessarily get paid time and a half if they put 60 hours in during a week, for instance. They're going to get 20 hours of that as additional time that they might be able to use at a future point in time. But it's primarily things like that would be different. It would be the differences between having someone be a manager and being less than a manager under the other contract.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Barbary? Council Member Masadi.
Hi, Dave. It's Jennifer Masadi. When you're talking about statutory changes, you're talking about at the state level, not the local level, correct?
I am. I don't know. I could be wrong about that. I don't know that there's really anything meaningful that we have from an ordinance standpoint that is part of this disciplinary process. It's all reflective of state law. And I think what typically gets pointed out is that Louisville's process is different. And one of the reasons, or the primary reason, that Louisville's process is different is the state law is different as it applies to Louisville. And so we are, I guess, generally speaking, it's Louisville is under one system. And I think generally speaking, the rest of the state police forces are under this other system, which is generally speaking, the Policeman's Bill of Rights on disciplinary issues.
That makes a big difference as far as us on a local level being able to make any changes. So I want that to be brought out.
Okay. All right. Other questions of Mr. Barbary? And that doesn't foreclose our going back to him or you're going back to him throughout this meeting. Okay, I want to switch over to Lieutenant Bastian. Lieutenant Bastian, before the meeting started, I introduced myself to you, and I hope you've looked at some of our meetings. Let me just set a little base here. You know, after the murder of George Floyd, you know that there was a large hue and cry and outrage, not just in Minneapolis, not just in the United States, but internationally, and a lot of cry for reform. One way in which that has taken shape in Lexington is, just one way, is that citizens want a say in police discipline. So that's one basis on which we come to you, or we've asked you to come to us, and we want to hear what you have to say about that. Another thing I'd like to ask you is, we have said from the beginning that this is about systems and not people. And you, Shirley, as the FOP and as an individual, must recognize that the climate is different now. And I would like for you to address how you think the FOP is going to change its approach, and what the FOP is doing or intends to do to detect and correct systemic racism. So I just wanted to set those predicates, and you can go ahead and go in any direction you want.
Okay. Thanks for the opportunity. I appreciate it. Excuse me. One of the things I do want to point out is I did ask what you would like me to prepare for. And just so everyone else is aware, the context under which I was operating is I was asked to do, and this is a quote, "Similar to the council presentation, although our focus is racial justice, please ask him to convey the FOP stance on these efforts to identify and eliminate systemic racism. Please tell him to be prepared to tell us what the FOP is doing to identify and combat systemic racism." So that's how I prepared under that context to speak with you guys today. So I did ask Ms. Hatfield to email out a document, and I'm going to kind of operate similarly to the way that Dr. Potter did, and just highlight some of that document. There's no reason you're all capable of reading. I'm not going to try to belabor things.
I will tell you, I have not had time to read it, and I don't know whether other people have. And so you should not assume familiarity with that.
Okay. Well, what I'll do is I'll hit the highlights, and then if people have specific
Potter's statement 2 or 3 days in advance, or at least a day in advance. We just got yours this afternoon.
Yeah. So just a little bit about the Fraternal Order of Police. It is a nationwide organization, has about 354,000 members in 2,100 different lodges. There's an FOP in every state in the United States. There's also some in Canada. Bluegrass Lodge 4 is who I represent, is one of 2 lodges in Fayette County. The other lodge represents certain corrections officers at the detention center. For Lodge 4, we have about 1,000 members who are either current or former law enforcement. A little bit about what we do. We serve a lot of different roles. We are obviously a fraternal organization, and we sponsor events for our families and our members. We're a charitable organization. We donate thousands of dollars every year to local athletic teams and to local clubs. We also sponsor over 200 children for Shop with a Cop every year. And then lastly, and the reason why I'm here in front of you is we're the approved collective bargaining agent for the Lexington Police Department. We represent all of the Lexington police officers, with the exception of about 20 of them who've chosen not to be FOP members. We also have a number of members who are currently employed by the Fayette County Sheriff's Office, Fayette County Public Schools, University of Kentucky Police, and then assorted federal and state agencies that are also in Fayette County. As Mr. Barbary pointed out, our collective bargaining rights do come under KRS 67A. The 2 sections that are primarily of interest are probably 67A, 6902(1), which gives police officers, firefighters, and correctional personnel the right to collectively bargain over questions of wages, hours, and other conditions of employment. 67A.69082 talks about the procedure for doing a collective bargaining agreement and how a urban county government and the collective bargaining the labor organization have to agree to that. Mr. Barbary already touched on the collective bargaining process a little bit. I'll just point out that in the officers and sergeants contract, we have 8 members who are covered by the contract that form the collective bargaining team, plus the president of the FOP. And then the lieutenants have 3 members on their collective bargaining team, plus the president of the FOP. As Dave mentioned, a lot of there are mandatory topics of collective bargaining, and the disciplinary system is one of them. It's been recognized by the court system as a condition of work. We do have the requirement on both sides to negotiate in good faith on the mandatory topics. And as well, we may or may not have to negotiate about certain permissive topics. As Mr. Barbary mentioned, the CBA for the officers and sergeants has expired, but it's operating under an evergreen clause. The collective bargaining agreement for the lieutenants will expire at the end of October. One of your questions, Judge Kaufman, and one which I kind of prepared for is, what is the FOP doing? I think the first thing to point out is systemic racism. Most of the sources that I've found identify systemic racism is dealing primarily with educational and opportunity and economic opportunity disparities. And I think those unfortunately tend to play out sometimes in the judicial system, where that possibly magnifies it. There's very little that the Fraternal Order of Police can do to change both educational and economic opportunities, but we do make efforts. For example, we do perform community outreach. I mentioned Shop with a Cop. Last year, we took over 225 children, all of them economically disadvantaged children, most, disproportionately children of color, shopping for Christmas presents to build community relations and to make a difference to those children. This year, for the first time ever, and believe it or not, we planned it before the pandemic started. We did back to school Shop with a Cop, again, focusing on disadvantaged children. And the goal was to help them buy school clothes. We partnered with a local church to provide school supplies so that children going from 5th grade into 6th grade had an opportunity to kind of start that big jump on a positive footing with new clothes and all the school supplies they needed. Whether or not they get to wear those school clothes to school is going to be obviously still up in the air, but that was our intent this year. FOP, obviously one of our jobs is to advocate for higher wages. While that sounds obvious, I think one of the advantages to that is that if Lexington is recognized as a place where people can earn a good wage for doing the job, we're going to attract higher qualified candidates. And I think our citizens want higher qualified candidates, and our citizens will benefit from higher qualified candidates. And frankly, our members would prefer to work with highly qualified candidates. There's research, Dr. Potter didn't mention it in his presentation, but there's a body of research in criminology that indicates that having a bachelor's degree is generally associated with police officers using less force. Our contract both rewards a bachelor's degree as well as provides tuition reimbursement to encourage police officers to obtain bachelor's degree. We've also lobbied for various changes to state laws. One example is the gang recruitment bill, which is KRS 506, 135 through 190. We assisted in getting that passed in 2018. This changed the definition of gangs and actually increased the penalties for bringing young people into the gang life. The National Gang Center indicated from 1996 through 2011, approximately 80 to 85% of all gang members are people of color. Approximately 40% of all gang members are juveniles, and over 90% of all gang members are male. So essentially, gangs are preying upon young men of color. And the FOP, working with the state legislature, gave a tool to local law enforcement to focus on the people who are trying to recruit those young men into a life of crime and starting this whole criminal pipeline issue that your committee has been talking about in part. You know, one of the questions that the vice chair has asked me to address was the issue of what we think about what the FOP's position is on your committee's efforts. So, you know, I'd like to say I do understand how challenging that your task is. You're being asked to find solutions to problems that have existed for decades, if not centuries. Numerous other people have tried to attack them and combat them, and obviously not been successful. You're also dealing with the judicial side of the issue, which again, as I would suggest, is it's actually the final stage of it. People aren't entering this system until the economic and the educational systems have failed them, and crime becomes the remaining opportunity. So I think it's a very challenging task, and I recognize that. But I will say that the FOP has had some concerns. You know, for example, you did hear from Dr. Potter. I know you have deemed him an expert, but I would say it's important to put out that almost all of his research is actually into organized crime, not into policing. Excuse me, I think that's my computer dinging, and I apologize for that. I'm gonna see if I can close out that email there. So almost all of his research is into organized crime. That doesn't make him unqualified, but I'm not sure it makes him an expert. But the important thing about that is that he actually started his presentation by saying he was going to present national data and national trends. And both Dr. Potter and your subcommittee constantly came back and started talking about local issues and using the nationalized data. And I don't think that's fair to the city of Lexington. I don't think it's fair to the Lexington Police Department. And I don't think it's fair to the members of the Fraternal Order of Police, because you're looking at national trends, not at Lexington issues.
Excuse me,
Yes.
Lieutenant Ashton. So are you bringing us some local data?
I don't know what local data you want. I'd be happy to work on some.
FOP keeping local data on the areas in which Dr. Potter discussed these various issues?
No, the FOP does not keep that data.
So actually, the local data doesn't even exist yet, does it?
I don't know what data would be available from the police department in a different format.
Well, for example, one of the things we talked about was how do police spend their time? And one thing that Dr. Potter suggested is that it may be helpful to look at 911 calls and look at a survey, also a victimization survey. And he talked about, as you say, various national statistics, but is the FOP pursuing the conducting of surveys or studies that would give us local statistics on those issues?
I don't think that's our purview, ma'am. We're not doing it, but that's outside the scope of what our purpose is.
Okay.
FOP is the national organization, you said, correct?
We are a local
Chapters, you're
lodge.
local, but there are chapters nationally.
Correct.
So those national statistics will be applicable to all the other FOPs, for sure.
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm sorry.
You were referring to Dr. Potter's national, which he did explicitly qualify before the meeting and during the meeting. But there are national FOPs that national data would be applicable to.
Not really. Each policing is a very localized issue. I think Dr. Potter may have alluded to it. There are approximately 18,000 police agencies, local and state police agencies across the United States. So I don't think it's reasonable to take any nationalized data and apply that to any local department individually. I do think it's important to look at local data, and his suggestions on gathering local data, I believe, are valid. I just would caution against trying to use the nationalized trends to intimate that there is a local issue.
It has to be an aggregation of various local police departments.
So depends on, I looked at some, I know some of the research that Dr. Potter referenced. So there's a couple of different ways you can look at it. Some places will do aggregated analysis where they might use national databases or national surveys to provide those national trends. The other way it's done is that researchers can use specific police departments, which may or may not be identified in the research, and draw conclusions from that. So for example, it could be a researcher partners specifically with the San Francisco Police Department and gathers the data that they have for their particular research question. And while that becomes relevant in San Francisco, it may or may not apply in Oakland. It may or may not apply in St. Louis, and it may or may not apply in Lexington. So as I said, his issue of gathering local data, I think, is a valid statement. But I don't believe it is fair to apply national trends to any individual police department without specifically saying, we got the data from this police department.
We have looked at some local data that does have disparities. That does imply that there is systemic racism even in our local police department. Just wanted to be clear on that.
Chief has been so nice to give us a lot of data, sometimes more than we want. Thank you, but I love it. I love it. But we do have a lot of data, and we've talked to, at least Mr. Cozart and I have talked to Chief Weathers. So we do have some things, but as you say, for example, a crime survey in Lexington, a victimization survey in Lexington, we don't have that. But we don't have it. It would have to be created.
Yes, I do think it would have to be created, and you would have to specifically find out what information you want to gather and how you want to use that in order to create that survey.
All right, please go ahead. Judge Isaac.
Yeah, I just had an initial question for the lieutenant. What percentage of the Lexington Police Department officers are in the FOP?
As I mentioned, there are currently approximately 600 police officers in Lexington, and we represent all but 20 of them, roughly.
Okay. Okay. So vast majority. Okay.
Yes.
Thank
So the 97%, I guess it is.
you. Okay.
One other thing I would like to point out that I think has gotten lost in the shuffle a lot, and I think Councilmember Masadi has tried to mention it a few times. You're overlooking that you currently have a citizen review process in place in Lexington. The Lexington Fayette Urban County Government Council is the citizen review process, and it's 15 elected people who have to answer to the electorate, and every single major disciplinary issue comes before them to be addressed. And the council hears it hears it in public. The Herald Leader usually publishes the information, and then the council has the right to accept, reject, or hold a hearing regarding that particular discipline. So to say that the public's not involved in the disciplinary process, I don't think you can find anywhere a place that actually has more public involvement, because it's truly the elected leaders who are ultimately approving the discipline.
You say we're overlooking it, and I don't know about everybody else on here, but I'm not overlooking it. Council member Masadi talked to us about that. And she said, we are the citizens involved. But another thing she said was, we'd kind of like to be involved earlier. Is there any, do you think there's any receptivity to earlier involvement by citizens? Or are you going to just not even consider that?
What do you mean by earlier involvement of citizens?
Well, you'd have to ask Councilmember Masadi, but you know, we're certainly not overlooking anything one of our own members said, and maybe you could tell a little bit more about that, Councilmember Masadi. I thought you said you'd like to be involved earlier as a council.
Well, I can tell you that I think I know where Councilmember Masadi, and if I'm wrong, I know she'll correct me. You know, the FOP is open to discussing anything. We have an obligation to do that, and we'll be happy to do that. You know, certainly one of our interests is to ensure that the process works. I know that there's been a lot of discussion in your group that the police can't be trusted to police the police, and frankly, that I'm a little disappointed in that you feel you have that low an opinion of the women and men of the FOP and the Lexington Police Department that we want to work with bad police officers. I can assure you, we don't. A bad police officer is an awful beat partner, and my members don't want to work with awful police officers. A bad police officer is extremely difficult to supervise. As a supervisor, I don't want to have to work with a bad police officer. So there are inherent things that we want to control as well, because we don't want them here either. And it's a little disheartening that this subcommittee is basically saying we don't trust you. And I don't know that there's evidence to indicate that we shouldn't be trusted. But again, to answer your question, we'd be open to anything.
Councilmember
Mr.
Masadi,
McCarty?
you
Yes.
want to go ahead and make
Sure.
a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to qualify my answer. We as council members don't get any input into the disciplinary process. We get something put in front of us at a docket at a council meeting, and basically either the chief or someone in the command comes forward and says there's been an action taken against a certain police officer or a firefighter in that respect, correctional officer. And there's not a lot of detail, but basically it's based upon the recommendation, and we go forward on that recommendation. My thought process was, and I've spoken to Lieutenant Bastian about this, is maybe to get us involved, not either us or someone else, i.e. maybe citizens, at an earlier stage in the process, so they can formulate basically the decision on what kind of discipline to take. And I think that's what I was trying to tell everyone, that we're not on this decision making until the very end. We have no input in the process whatsoever, but we are the final review board for sure.
Yes, I'd like to, if I may. And I think, as I have an understanding of that, Councilman member Masadi, is that, you know, like you're saying, it's a pretty, I would say, limited view of, you know, it's a recommendation. It's a small, you know, I think it's about a page or two document. It's not a real extensive, you know, overview of the details of an investigation or the process of that disciplinary, you know, kind of a ladder of how this process really, you know, evolved. And it's based upon, as you said, that recommendation that is coming to you. And I do echo that. I think there's real value in that earlier participation into those disciplinary matters. You know, not only by the council, but, you know, the reflection that citizens really are expressing this. You know, this is not based upon just the limited view of this committee. I think that we are here on behalf of a large, you know, of citizens, you know, across in our city. And, you know, and I wanted to ask, if I may, you know, since I do want to understand, like, you know, one of the things that I noticed when I was just reviewing documents, you know, kind of getting ready for this meeting and everything, was that, you know, with the FOP, and I was looking at the 90 pages that are a part of your collective bargaining agreement, and is that it almost seems that for every piece of process, you know, that the police department as an organization is involved in, the FOP is also involved in. You know, like I think I counted like, 60 different areas in which your engagement into the policies and processes of the police department are present. And within that, I mean, I guess my question is that the case? And, and I think where, people have not only areas of discipline, but there's several other areas that are involved that people, have questions about. But, just generally those areas of engagement that involve policy, I think we want to have a better understanding. What is the need? If we're looking at just those very basic areas of wages and salaries and compensation and benefits and performance, why is there a need to have such, such engagement at that level? Whoever would like to answer that.
So is your question, why does the FOP review the department's policies?
No, I'm asking why. Yeah, I'm asking why that in that collective bargaining agreement, then what is the need of such the level of engagement with that? You represent, members of your organization, but you're saying that the main areas are working conditions, compensation, benefits, and, performance, but there's engagement in lots of other areas. So I'd like to understand that a little better.
Yeah, I don't know that we have engagement in a lot of different areas. I know that the collective bargaining agreement does address a number of different topics. The majority of them actually do cover wages, benefits. One of the big areas is the issue of promotions and selection for specialized units. And there's areas of hours of work. There's a section on how the grievance procedure works, so that if one of our members believes that a supervisor has violated the contract, it outlines a process for how that would be handled, so that all of us come at it from the same page. Really, the purpose of the collective bargaining agreement is to give the police chief and his staff a book to follow on. We all agree these are the rules on how we're going to be employed. There is a section of the collective bargaining agreement that gives the police chief what are called managerial rights. He can add or subtract positions based on the needs of the police department. In fact, I think you're aware he's done that. So he is given certain latitudes based on managerial rights. There is a provision in the CBA where the Fraternal Order of Police does get to review every policy before it gets published. That review is mandatory. However, our input may or may not be valuable in it. There's a lot of policies that do not cover issues that the FOP would consider to be a breach of his managerial duties. If he, for example, if Chief Weathers wanted to move the Public Integrity Unit from the Bureau of Investigations back into the office of the chief so that it's not in the investigations unit anymore, that's not an FOP issue. We would never object to that, and we haven't. And I think Chief Maynard can probably chime. I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I think he can chime in that there have been a lot of areas where the FOP objects to nothing because it's completely managerial rights. There are also areas where the FOP has objected because we feel that either one, the new policy doesn't take into consideration certain realities on the street. And there have been times where after that consideration, the administration has changed the policy back or taken into consideration our input. And there have been other times where the agency said, yeah, we disagree with you and we want to do it this way. So I don't know if that really answers your question, Ms. Queen, but that's kind of the background behind it. There are, as Mr. Barbary mentioned, 42 different articles in it, but it's not as wide ranging as you might originally think. A lot of it is hours, how sick leave is calculated, how many hours you earn for vacation, when you get to take vacation, how who gets to when you can put in for vacation over Christmas, how that's awarded, by when you have to put in, like all those rules are put in place because that way we all know what we're playing to. We are all following the same rule book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, thank you for that response and I appreciate it. I just, as you think about this, it's very complex, because you have an organization that is here on behalf of the citizens. It is managed as an organization of government. It is, acting on behalf of the needs of the community. But then you have, which are also members of people that are part of the police department. And then, an association that is working in concert with the police department that has a great deal of power and, let's say, influence about how policies are created. So I find that to be, first of all, very complex in nature. And I think there is plenty of room for meaningful questions for, how does this really play out for citizens when we're talking about areas of disciplinary matters, when we're talking about how that, the transparency and the legitimacy and the perception that the citizens really have of the fair and trusting processes. So, I don't want to take all of your time, but I've got some other questions, but I'm going to hold for a minute just till in respect to others.
Can I ask a
Thank you.
question?
Sister Wright.
I have a question. I think it might be a better question posed to Mr. Barbary. I think that's the correct pronunciation of your name. So one of the questions that I have asked before was about the ways in which we already have processes where there is some slight review of, I think this applies to local law enforcement officers. So we have the Ethics Commission that deals with city employees and the Civil Service Review Board. So for instance, the way I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that for instance, if an officer were using their city allotted equipment to run a small business separate from the police department, right? So if we are allowed under the collective bargaining agreement, that kind of oversight, why is that permitted, but other kinds of citizen oversight are not permitted?
I think the practical answer to that is probably twofold. I think that with respect to bargaining has only existed in Lexington since about 2005. So I think any process generally speaking, any process that predated the collective bargaining agreement that everybody understood would widely apply to employees. It has more or less carried over going forward. So I think the agreement, whether it expressly says this or not, it does allow for those processes that existed outside of the collective bargaining to still carry forward. I think the other distinction with respect to a review process that involves discipline as part of the process is you have a disciplinary process that's in the agreement right now, and any material change that you made to that is going to require bargaining. And then depending on what exactly the change you're looking for is, it might also require that statutory change as well, because a great deal of that existing disciplinary process is statutorily derived. I guess the best example, and I might have briefly touched on this before, is there is a review board. That's not part of the statute right now. It is part of the agreement. Like, let's say hypothetically, you wanted to change the makeup of that board that gives the chief advice on disciplinary matters. If you wanted to change the makeup of that board, that could be done outside the statutory process. But let's say we wanted to add a number of citizens or persons outside the police department onto that review process that gives the chief advice on discipline. That's going to require the FOP to sign off ultimately on what that newly constituted board would look like. So, and that's because, in my opinion, that's because there is already a board and a disciplinary process in the contract. So when you materially change that, it is something that would be a mandatory bargaining situation, and they would be required to be in agreement with that. I think that, yes.
So part of the reason I'm asking you this question, thank you for that. You did explain this to us previously, but there also, I think, is an implication that somehow citizens would be unable or lack a capacity to participate in these types of reviews. And what I'm suggesting is that the fact that we have this board that predates the collective bargaining process, that operates and has been operating and functioning continuously, I think would go against the idea that somehow citizens cannot accurately understand police policy or city policy and fairly and in an unbiased way enact that policy when necessary.
Sure, but let me,
correct?
so one of the other distinctions though, I think that, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't think that I am. The police and fire departments have never statutorily had their discipline handled by that Civil Service Commission, which is comprised of citizens, as you've pointed out. They have always had, for various reasons, I guess, they have always had a statutory creation where it is the Urban County Council people that ultimately decide their discipline. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and I'm not disagreeing with you, but I think functionally they have had a disciplinary process in place that is different from the civil service process, really, I think, ever since the Urban County government was created. So for whatever reasons, police and fire have had a separate disciplinary process in place than, for instance, me. If I was getting disciplined, I ultimately would go in front of that, or potentially go in front of that Civil Service Commission, which is comprised, I think, of 5 citizens. So their process has always been different. I do understand exactly what you're saying.
You're saying they have no oversight over, because my understanding that if there are instances where that board does review the behavior of both firefighters and police officers.
I think that the ethics commission will review discrete ethical issues that are brought in front of them. That is correct. But the Civil Service Commission does not get involved in police or fire discipline at all. Mm-hmm. But if someone, for instance, your example, yes, if someone if someone said there's a police officer that's benefiting by virtue of their position in the police department, they have this side business and they're doing this or that, that person could be brought in front of the ethics commission, and the ethics commission could act within whatever their purview to address that issue ends up being.
Thank you for that, Mr. Barbary. Can I say one more thing, Judge Kaufman and Mr. Cozart? I think, Mr. Bastian, it's somewhat unfair to characterize the description of the people who've been working on this committee as having a low perception of police officers. And I think one of the difficulties in situations like this, when dealing with or trying to get a good understanding of what we have been charged to do, is the ways in which at times the Fraternal Order of Police tries to position any questions about reform. We live in this community and we respect the people who live here, and we're just trying to do our best to do what we have been asked to do by the citizens who live here. I really appreciate you taking the time to come here. And one of the questions I would ask is, given your criticisms of the research that we've heard before, we would be very much open to any kind of research done by the Fraternal Order of the Police or by researchers who you think have done a good job in presenting documents or any kind of information well that we should use when we're considering the kinds of suggestions that we will be making. We'd be more than open to that, as Mr. Maynard has done for us in previous instances.
Can I ask a question? Mr. Bastian, would it be fair to say that if you believe that some of the data that Professor
Potter.
what was
Potter.
I'm so sorry, Professor Potter, but that Professor Potter said that we probably need, and I understand with that you caveat, like you can't, localize, nationalize data, but we have to start that we cannot assume that there is no systemic racism in the Lexington Police Department, and if we need data to try to resolve what that racism may look like, is the FOP willing to take that back to the membership, include that as we're going to gather this data so that we can analyze it and then come up with resolutions, problem solving with that?
You're asking if the FOP would become a data gathering organization?
No, not data gathering. We wouldn't ask the FOP to do that, but certainly that if the you're saying that you don't have that data to say that we're not doing something right. Would the FOP be willing to include the fact that certain data will be gathered?
I think the police department currently has the ability to collect a lot of data without any sort of need to confer with the FOP on it. I think obviously there would be certain confidentiality things and probably areas of collective bargaining that might be covered depending on what the data is. But the police department currently collects a lot of data, and I think Chief Maynard demonstrated that. Apparently he's overwhelmed you with data.
I have a couple questions.
Well, Sheriff Witt, I think, has also been trying to ask a question. Ms. Hatfield just pointed that out to me. So would you go ahead?
That's okay. I do appreciate all the comments, and I do appreciate the comments recently about Dr. Price, but I do have to say that ever since several meetings ago, a comment was made within our membership that offended me. I think it offended me for the men and women at the police department, for the chief. I was offended for him. I was offended for the men and women at the sheriff's office to say, police, police, the police, and then they go home and sleep with each other. That comment was offensive. It shouldn't have been said. I know that we're looking at systems, and if you look at the system of the sheriff's office, the system of the police department, what you have are men and women who have chosen to stand between good and evil every single day, who have chosen to leave their families and risk their life every day for our citizens. And so that comment in and of itself was and still is offensive. When we look at the makeup of this board, when a citizen wants to file a complaint against a judge, where do they go? The Judicial Conduct Commission, which is made up of attorneys investigating the judge who is an attorney. When a citizen wants to file a complaint against an attorney, where do they go? To the Kentucky Bar Association, who is made up of attorneys. And so the comment in and of itself is offensive. And so I hope that today I have righted a wrong in not saying that before. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. Mr. Dunn, did you have a question, or was that Mr. Harris? I can't.
I have a question.
Okay.
I guess for both. First of all, Mr. Bastin, you were alluding to the fact that this committee seems not to trust the police. And well, I guess back to Ms. Queen's statement about the FOP being involved in so many areas with the police department. Is it the FOP's position that the police department does not know how to run itself? And if that's your position, could you please provide us with any data, any stats that would show that the police department doesn't know how to police itself or even run the police department and does require or need the FOP to get in and tell it what to do?
So I think there's a couple of different aspects to your question. So if I miss one, I apologize. And please ask me again and I'll try to hit that one. So I don't think I've ever suggested that the police department doesn't know how to run the police department. My goal and the Fraternal Order of Police's job is to protect certain rights of its employees. And that's due process rights in discipline, and it's collective bargaining rights for all employees, regardless of whether they're going through discipline or not. As I mentioned, the contract specifically gives the chief of police managerial rights, giving him certain latitudes to run the police department as he sees fit. Frankly, and I've used this example to a number of people before, if Chief Weathers decided tomorrow he wanted us all to wear pink uniforms, we would all come in pink uniforms. That's not an FOP issue. This image that the FOP is this all-powerful thing, we're not the Teamsters of 1970s. We're in the state of Kentucky, which is a right-to-work state for the most part. The issue of what the Fraternal Order Police does is try to ensure the wages, benefits, and working conditions of our employees so that we're attracting the best employees that we can, so that we're retaining the best employees that we can, and that everyone is facing the same playing field. And it's not any different than the employee handbook that LFUCG puts out for all of its civilian employees, where there's a set of rules that all of them have to follow. There's a process if you want to discipline somebody, and Mr. Barbary can go into more detail if you'd like him to, but if you have a person in the finance department that you want to discipline for certain behavior, there is a process for that. And there's specific rules that get applied, and there's a specific way it has to be handled, and it has to march through. If you want to be promoted in the civil service process, you want to go from a staff assistant senior to an administrative principal, there's a process for that. And really, all our contract does is lay out that process for police officers, police sergeants, and police lieutenants. The commanders and assistant chiefs are appointed from the lieutenant ranks, so they have certain rights that appear in the collective bargaining agreements. However, they don't have certain rights because they're appointed by the chief. So there is wide latitude in how that's handled. And so I don't know if that adequately answers your question, Mr. Harris, but hopefully it gives you a little bit of framework for it.
Well, it doesn't quite, but let me give a follow-up. Is it your position or the FOP's position that the Policeman's Bill of Rights doesn't do enough to protect the police, or is not equipped to protect the police, or even have within its mechanism the ability to do the things that you just talked about?
It's two separate issues. Policeman's Bill of Rights deals, which is KRS 15520, that deals with the disciplinary process alone. And KRS 15520 is actually incorporated in our contract in the CBA. The other issues, the promotional issues, the how many hours of vacation you get, all of those kind of things, we outline in our collective bargaining agreement, just as the rest of the civil service positions have it outlined in the employee handbook. In fact, in the police contracts, our vacation policies essentially mirror those of LFUCG and their civilian employees. The only difference that I'm aware of offhand is that police employees can have a larger carryover in vacation balances, but otherwise we earn the same as other city employees.
Okay, the last question I have, I guess, is for Mr. Barbary, because I was just wondering, are there other divisions or departments within the Lexington Federal County government have a collective bargaining body like the FOP does? Well, like the police and fire does?
Yeah, so I think I might have mentioned this a little while ago, but so in Kentucky, with public employees, you have to be given the statutory authority to be able to bargain. And with respect to Lexington, the only divisions that have collective bargaining are community corrections, which is the jail, the fire department, and the police department. And I believe each one of those divisions or departments has two contracts similar to police. One of them is for their upper level employees, and the other one is for their officers and maybe the next level up from an officer. I think that police is technically represented by the same lodge for both of their contracts. I think that fire is technically represented by the same lodge on both of their contracts. And then I think corrections actually has two different, I think they have two different ones. So the
They
number
do. They
of
have
different,
two
the number
different
of
bargaining
different-
agents.
yeah, the number of different unions varies by which department you're talking about. And this is more than you need to know, but technically, they have a process that they go through to get recognized as the bargaining unit for that particular type of employee. You could potentially have, I guess, in the future, a situation where the sergeants don't feel like they're getting adequately represented by the FOP or lodge on certain issues, and they may try to have another organization represent them. But where we stand right now is those are the only departments or divisions in Lexington that have collective bargaining. Your solid waste division has a meet and confer contract, but because the statute does not include them, they do not have collective bargaining. And then I think one of the other distinctions between us and Louisville is I want to say that Louisville may have opened up bargaining for all of their employees over there. So I couldn't tell you how many different unions they have over in Louisville, but I suspect it may be a different one for almost every division of their government over there. So, but you're looking at having those three divisions or departments in Lexington to have collective bargaining.
So we're looking at about 20 minutes, Judge. You're muted, Judge Kaufman. We're looking at about 20 minutes. I know Judge Ernesto had his hand up, and I want to make sure that we get closure with
A question too.
Barbie and Kim. So, Brother Scorsone and then Sister Henderson. Is that
Yeah,
all right,
thank you.
Judge?
Thank you. And Lieutenant, thank you very much for coming. Listen, I'll be the first to say we've got incredible talent, dedicated folks in our police force. Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. But our concern is about perhaps some that might not be exceptional officers, and particularly when it comes to racism and race issues. And I mean, quite frankly, I mean, are you suggesting that there is no problem, that the committee should just adjourn? Or, you know, I mean, this would be the only profession that doesn't have a problem. I mean, I come from the legal side. We've surveyed our bunch, lawyers and judges. We got a problem. We know that. And we were trying to do something about it. The question is, does the FOP want to be a partner in trying to deal with racism in law enforcement? And if so, you know, how do you think that partnership could work out? What do you think the FOP can bring to the table to try to deal with issues of racism?
Well, I will say, from my personal experience, I have not seen overt racism in Lexington Police Department. I would encourage you, if you would like, I can probably come up with some names. Why don't you talk to some of our officers of color? People who've been here for 10, 15, 30 years, and ask them how the culture here is towards not only people of color in the community, but people of color in the police department.
Lieutenant, I'm sitting as a judge right now. I've seen cases where I think the arrest was made because it was a person of color. And there has been no doubt about that. And anecdotally, you can hear that from lots of other folks. Now, there may
I think
not
there's
be
a difference between
on a national level, but I'd be hard pressed to believe that we don't have any problem in Fayette County.
I think there's always an opportunity for improvement. And as I mentioned before, the FOP is always willing to discuss anything. We are partners in this. We try to work with the police administration as much as we can. We try to work with the community as much as we can. But I think it's important to recognize, ultimately, our job is to represent our membership. But our membership is also varied. We have people of different races. We have people of different genders. We have people of different sexual orientations. We have people of different religions. So we're not a monolith, just like this, the city of Lexington is not a monolith. So we try to meet the needs of everybody, and that includes everybody in our membership, and that represents the community in some aspects.
I think we're looking to you for some guidance and some leadership in how to deal with the issue. And that's why you're here, really.
You know, I began by laying a predicate here today, Lieutenant Bass. That is to say, those of us who have been judges or are judges are looking inside to see what the judicial system can do. Those of us who are prosecutors are looking inside. The first meeting we ever had, Ms. Baird said, we're having conversations. And so I simply asked you then, and I continue to ask you, you know, we have a culture in which people are afraid of the race issue. And so many things are inherently racist. We're having unconscious bias training everywhere, including the police department. We wouldn't need that training if people didn't have unconscious biases. And all I'm asking, and all Judge Scorsone is asking, and this whole committee is asking is, what's the FOP willing to do? And maybe you're not ready to say it today, but we would like to know what the FOP is willing to do in these different times. It is a different time, but I don't want to take up any more time. Ms. Baird, didn't you have a question?
I did, thank you. And it's kind of a sort of a two-parter situation. The first part of it is, and I'm hoping I didn't misunderstand Councilwoman Masadi when she said it, but she was talking about the council wanting, kind of getting it after the fact and wanting to be kind of aware of the investigation and maybe involved in the recommendation kind of ahead of time. I don't know if I misunderstood what she said, but part of that, my question is, since they kind of review it after the fact, is there a way to move that process up, or does the confidentiality of that investigation stay through until the chief makes a recommendation or the disciplinary review board makes a recommendation? Does it have to stay confidential all the way through until the end, or is there a way to back that up a little bit? And then kind of the second part of that, we've talked about the Civil Service Commission and the Ethics Board. Luckily, I haven't had to go in front of either one of them, but I don't know how that works. So does that group, those two groups, are they involved in the investigation of those allegations, or is there somebody else conducting the investigation and then just giving that information to the council?
Could I insert something here? I did get a text when we were discussing this earlier. I got a text from Glenda George in the law department. And she said that if we want to discuss the Ethics Commission and Civil Service Commission, we could do that. She did go on to say that if a complaint is brought to the Ethics Commission, it is referred to the Internal Affairs Unit of Police or Fire. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Gotcha. So the ethics, because it doesn't sound like they are investigating, it is investigated by PIU too. I see the notes are shaking her head. So
and so Judge Murphy, right? Yeah.
Okay, so it would be similar situation. But then back to the first part then about the confidentiality about when that kicks in.
Okay, so the confidentiality portion is derived from state law. And it's a struggle. And I think it's probably based upon the fact that they don't want to have the body that might ultimately hear a case prejudiced by something they hear at an earlier point in the process. They might only hear one side of the story. It might get slanted a little bit depending on how it's presented to them. And so it's really, I believe, the statute is largely there to try to protect that process. So I think it would be very difficult to bring in the council at an earlier point in time, understanding that they would be ultimately the deliberative body that would still hear the case. Now, if that was no longer the case, that probably wouldn't be as much of a problem. And I don't know that it would be as much of a problem, although there still is a confidentiality that needs to be kept in place. if it was not the council that was involved at the earlier point in the process. For example, hypothetically, if you added 2 to 5 citizens onto the review board that is giving the chief advice on disciplinary matters, if they weren't council members, you wouldn't have that same concern about ultimately that deliberative body that might hear and decide the ultimate discipline as to that person being prejudiced at an earlier point in time by hearing information.
May I ask a question, Judge Kaufman?
Dr. Price?
So are these same concerns about confidentiality and impartial deliberation applied when choosing those people? I think they come from the chiefs and commanders who hear review. So do you have the same prohibitions against no ethical ties or no previous supervisors? Are those also built into the disciplinary process within the police department?
I think they're supposed to be, but I don't know how well they're articulated in the collective bargaining agreement. But that certainly would be the goal. And I certainly think that they are under an obligation not to discuss those cases with people outside of that forum until ultimately the discipline has been levied and accepted by the council.
You know, we have obviously a robust discussion, and we could probably go on forever, but I would like to, Council Member Masadi has her hand up. Can we take her question? And then I'd like to pivot over to Mr. Cozart to talk about going forward.
Thank you, Judge. I'll just cut to the chase on this. As a council, we get on the docket, we get maybe 1 or 2 lines that said there's a police disciplinary action. Again, they come forward to us. They explain that there's a general order or whatever has been, there's been something that has been done against this general order. And then we are at that time, we can ask questions. We can ask any kind of question we want to the commander that's in front of us, asking us to give specifics. More than likely, we go based upon what the chief has recommended at that time, because we believe it's been vetted pretty properly. I will say that there are a few council members, and I have spoke to Lieutenant Bastian about this, and that feel that maybe at that process prior to that, there can be some citizens involved in that. So they have what we're talking about today. They have some transparency and they have some input into the decision-making before the council gets it. Lieutenant and I have talked about this on different occasions, and I found him and the FOP to be pretty receptive. And I don't want to say too much because I know you're in bargaining now, but I think there is a way to make a compromise and have this work before it just comes to us as this body, and there could be some citizen input on this. I just wanted to put that in because I think it's really important. That's what we're all trying to understand is how can we make this work for everybody? How can citizens feel like they're being represented? How can we make a good decision? And how can the police feel like, they're being supported as well? It's a tough deal, but I think it can be done. And I think the FOP is willing, aren't you, Lieutenant?
Absolutely, and I've tried to state that we are willing. Just a couple of clarifications to add on to what Councilmember Masadi and Mr. Barbary explained. The purpose of the fairly limited discussion is exactly as Mr. Barbary mentioned, because ultimately the Urban County Council becomes both the judge and the jury of any disciplinary action that goes to a full hearing. And so to protect the due process rights of the police officer, as Mr. Barbary said, they can't get half the story and then already decide before the trial starts the person's guilty or the person's not guilty. It's not fair to them. So that's the process behind that and why that exists. But as far as being open to suggestions, we're absolutely open, and I assure you we will negotiate in good faith when the time comes.
Thank you. And I think it's worth making one comment. We're having a little chat on the side, and Judge Scorsoni made this point, and I think it's worth noting, Lieutenant Bastian, that he made a minor correction to the sheriff's comments about judicial complaints. while the complaints do go to a judicial committee, there are 2 non-lawyer citizens on that committee. So it's not just the lawyers. All right, well, thank you, Lieutenant Bastian, for, as you say, being open to anything. Councilmember Masadi has vouched that you are. Council, thank you, Mr. Barbary, for coming to us from the law department as well. I can't say we won't be back to both of you, and we really appreciate it. Mr. Kozar, you want to talk about moving forward?
We will. I do want to honor Brandon Dunn, who earlier was seeking to say something real quick. Brandon, while we have our guests with us, if you still feel the need, or has it been addressed?
Yeah, it's all been addressed. It's fine. I mean, I'm just kind of looking at it's kind of more of a statement, but I'm gonna be very quick. I speaking to my father about looking at the way the police, everything, all their policies broke down. And I told him, I said, man, this looks good. It looks really good. I can't find anything that's not covered. Bias, everything, de-escalation. But when the charts come out, you actually have to look for it. That's why it's structured. I mean, it's not really blatant in your face like that. But when you see the charts, anybody that's just, and I don't want to try to put it like that, but anybody that's just, you look at those charts and see that they're very disproportionate. You can say that there is racism and racism exists. But if you turn a blind eye to it and you don't want to see it for what it is, that's part of the problem, man. So, I mean, you have to be open to seeing it and wanting to see it, opposed to just kind of turning a blind eye to it. So that's just basically all I wanted to say, man. But everybody has to see it for what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Don. I want to thank our guests for being here as well. There will likely be need for us to revisit. We have identified some actions that can be taken in reference to citizens' participation. I'm hearing the FOP and the city say they're open to that. I know the recommendations that we've had have looked at those opportunities of things that we can do now, regardless of KRS statute. Thank you, Sister Witt, for that palate cleansing. I want to do that, follow suit on that. When asked about systemic racism, you mentioned educational and economic issues. That's very insightful. The mayor was insightful to that degree, in that we have an economic and education component of this very commission. So thank you for that insight. You also mentioned the judicial system. That is exactly the direction that we're pivoting. So thank you for giving us some insights into how they regulate. And Judge Scorsone clarified that there is some citizen participation in that regulation. I got to cleanse my palate. You spoke from your lived experiences and your great job of supporting the Fraternal Order of Police. We have talked with African-American officers on and off books. We do that regularly. I do. I know. And so in reference to things that offend, overt racism is a little easier to fix. It's the systemic covert racism that is the challenge. And it comes from systematically being injected into systems and into us by virtue of being in those systems. And so when asked what we can do about racism, I would just offer that when you default to the programs that you do for young Black children, to many of us, that's offensive. But saying those things, so as you've offered things to help me grow from your experiences, I want to offer things that perhaps could help you and other colleagues grow from their experiences. Because, I mean, I work in human services. I do a lot of service for children and adults. But when asked about systemic racism, I don't talk about what I've done. We talk about what could perhaps be done in systems. So I just offer that as well. And so I appreciate those things. I'm talking Sister Witt, I'm not just talking with you, I'm talking to any of us that would, default to what we've done. So thank you for that. That's, yeah, I'm sorry.
Those are the other offensive thing that I caught was when the question was asked if there was any racism, the statement went to, you can ask our African-American officers and they don't see any racism. What the hell is that? I don't want to say too much more. I just was offended by some of the comments that he made, and I was trying to sit here and really be quiet, but it was very offensive, just like you said about shop with the cop and the little black kids that they take out to shop, and they got them some school clothes and they might not be able to wear them, but all of that.
Thank you for your insights. Thank you for that. And these are things that help us grow. This is the space that we're in, not just locally, but nationally. And we will see we will see those our hearts in this, and there are many good hearts on this call. And so the challenge is if we're willing to grow together and grow from one another. So our work will continue. Again, thank you, Brother Baston. Thank you, Brother Barbieri. We will continue to be in contact with you. As this committee continues, we will meet again Thursday. The agenda will be posted, but we will be moving to the justice component, looking at the litigants, both criminal and civil. We will be looking at the KBA survey on diversity to do some guiding of our work. We'll be looking at prosecution and defense and those areas, some of the areas that we were told today have some growth opportunities, and some of that we've been intonating, we've been talking about it tangentially and alluding to it even as we've done the police work. So this group has been very insightful in that way. But we will be looking at the litigants, and we will be looking at how can we identify and how can we make recommendations to ameliorate the systemic racism that is in the justice system, specifically the courts, civic or criminal and civil. We won't shift completely, but we will pace up because of our time. You will see us moving at a different rate and speed to get to our recommendations. I'll stop short of saying we'll reverse engineer from the recommendations, but we do want us thinking of our desired outcomes. And there's a great deal of experience and expertise on this group. So we're going to start with the desired outcomes we would like to have based on those things we know from our expertise, our jobs, our gifts, our skills, our vocations, and our lived experiences. And we'll very swiftly be working to get to recommendations around the justice system. So this is what we're seeking to do. Worthy work, heavy work. But we are very thankful for each one that is a part of this commission and those that are a part of this process and are willing in their heart to help improve the human condition for all of us, for everyone. So thank you. We'll continue looking at this systemic racism, and we'll continue fighting the battle. All right. Thank you, each one. We want to be respectful of time. We'll see you Thursday at 3.
Thank you all. I'll happy to answer any other questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all for your time. And I think you guys have my email if you need it.
Thank you. Thank you. Everybody have a good day. Stay safe.